idea of how that's being used here in Virginia and additional opportunities to develop collateral values in doing conservation here in Central Virginia in the Capital Region. So my job is I'm going to talk about collateral values in general. Todd's going to talk about collateral values here in the United States, which is about battlefields. And then Parker will talk about collateral values in the Capital Region. Before I talk about collateral values, to explain that concept, I need to introduce an additional concept. I need to introduce the concept of natural capital. So the idea of capital in a capitalist society is the value of things, the value of a business, the value of a house. Natural capital is the value of those things in nature, both renewable and non-renewable resources. So the oil under the groundwater that can be tapped for a well, as well as the renewable resources. So a healthy, intact forest provides ecosystem services that are valuable to us, such as cleaning the air, such as cleaning water that's headed for the streams and the groundwater. The biodiversity of an intact forest hosts insects that provide pollination services. So you can think about a natural landscape as having value in the same way that a business has values with the parts of the business. Just natural value instead of built values. The idea of collateral values is a play on collateral damage from wars and other military activity. You may be familiar with the idea that in wars, there are often terrible accidents. People get hurt, landscapes and buildings get destroyed by accident. That's called collateral damages. What we're talking about is that sometimes war and other type of conflicts results in landscapes being preserved in a way that their natural capital can be developed, and that we should take advantage of those opportunities. This is in no way to glorify or say that war is a good thing. It's saying that the importance of conservation is so important, we can't skip any opportunity. We should take advantage of anything we get. These collateral values come about from two basic areas: battlefields and borders. And I'll talk about each in a couple with some examples. So for battlefields, it helps to have in mind historical battles where you have thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of troops oriented on each side of a line. And the commanders were always looking for what they called good ground for these battlefields, huge open spaces where you can maneuver these divisions. And afterwards, that big space, if there was a desire to memorialize the battle, to remember who fought there, remember what they fought for, that land could be protected from development to allow its natural capital to return. An example of that, in France, there was a huge battle in World War I. So we're going way back, centered in an area of Verdun. This battlefield was huge, 19 miles long, in places 5 miles wide, a huge area that encompassed 9 villages. And as the battle raged, all the villages were destroyed and the landscape was just completely shattered. The steps there is before the war, you had these small villages. These villages were developing and growing. They were cutting down forests for agriculture. They were preserving some forests for timberlands. The war happens between 1914 and 1918. Approximately 50 square miles of land was just denuded. All the villages destroyed. Forests that weren't shattered by bomb blasts were cut down to prevent the other side from sneaking up on you. Complete and utter devastation. And initially, the land was left alone because people were afraid of all the unexploded ordnance. But eventually they started to see that as the forest began to recover, there was value in that. So they started doing some demining so that they could replant some forests, and some demining so they could put up places to memorialize what had happened there, what they fought for. And at this point, we have a very large area that is a tremendous value in terms of natural capital. So that's from World War I in Europe and France for battlefields being preserved by accident at first, just because people were afraid of the ordnance, and then becoming very conscious of the values and preserving and developing those. So that's battlefields. Borders can do something similar. So this is the Korean War Memorial up in Washington, D.C. The Korean War broke out in 1950, raged into 1953. Over those years, approximately over 36,000 American troops were killed. The estimates of Korean civilians and military dead, estimates range up to 2 million. So it was a terrible, horrendous conflict. And in the end, they settled back to the same border where it started. That border became heavily militarized, and it continues to this day as a very tense, dangerous place. A strip of land 150 miles long, in places 2 miles wide, never less than 2 miles wide, and in places expanded out to 10 or 12 miles because South Korea has attached some biodiversity parks to it. That land is a no man's land. Nobody builds there, nobody farms there, and it has recovered to become now the most important biodiversity reserve on the entire peninsula. Because just running from one side to the other, it samples almost all of the habitats of the Korean Peninsula. A similar thing is being done very consciously now from what was called the Iron Curtain. So at the height of the Cold War, East Germany put up a wall to separate East Germany from West Germany, mainly to prevent East Germans from fleeing to the West. And that wall connected up to fortifications along the entire European continent to separate the Soviet-aligned Warsaw Pact from the Western Europe-aligned NATO. And it was a no man's land. But as that Iron Curtain, as the Soviet Union fell apart and the Iron Curtain became unnecessary, that land began to recover. And now there's a very conscious plan to develop, to recreate natural habitats 150 kilometers wide across the entire length of the former Iron Curtain. So the nature of modern warfare, we are unlikely to get new battlefields that could potentially be used to create natural capital. Modern war is mostly fought in cities, and when the wars are over, people want to rebuild their cities. But there is a continuing effort around the world and in the United States to recover old battlefields, historical battlefields, to memorialize what happened there and to develop natural capital. That's become a particular thing in the United States. And I'd like to introduce Todd Lookingbill to tell you more about that.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, thanks, Peter. Great segue. And I should mention that there's a couple copies of the book on the table kind of out back. If you want to page through that, there's even ordering forms. If you're so ambitious, you get so enamored with what we're talking about, you'd like to order a copy. There's also an article that kind of accompanies the book that you're free to take handouts of that's back there as well. So last week, this amazing species, along with 22 other species, mostly birds, freshwater mussels, including One, the green blossom pearly mussel, whose range was exclusive to Tennessee and Virginia, were officially declared gone for good, extinct, removed from the Fish and Wildlife Service's endangered species list. So maybe you saw this news story. Maybe you're like one of my students that actually went out with their parents to try to track the last elusive ivory-billed woodpecker to no avail. We are certainly within a period of mass extinction. The United Nations estimates that 1 million animals and plants are now threatened with extinction. And the time to take action to protect these species is now. And so that's kind of where we're coming from in this talk today and kind of in writing this book. Stemming this extinction crisis is a central component of the ambitious 30 by 30 initiative that maybe you've heard about. It's this global effort to conserve, connect, and restore 30% of the world's lands and waters by 2030. So also last week in the news, a group of 9 of the uber rich, including Jeff Bezos and their philanthropic organizations, made the largest donation ever to nature conservation, pledging $5 billion to finance the 30 by 30 campaign, among other things. And pictures like the above, like this one, typically accompany these types of stories. And in fact, Jeff Bezos and his Earth Fund, they announced that they were initially focused on these high impact projects in the tropical Andes, the Congo Basin, and the Pacific Ocean. These beautiful and exotic, faraway natural areas should be protected, but it's worth considering whether some of these dollars couldn't be better spent in Bezos' own backyard, right here in Virginia, where species are blinking into extinction before our eyes. And there are some truly beautiful and endangered landscapes to protect. That's the central premise of our book that Peter just described, that these battlefield landscapes, these landscapes of warfare, are among the most threatened terrestrial ecosystems on Earth, but also hold the potential to provide enormous, what he was described as ecosystem services, great sites for conservation to protect some of these endangered species. And as Peter described, battlefields around the world are finding new purpose as parks and refuges. And in the book, we describe the evolution from the period of active conflict, depicted here on the left, through a period of memorialization to a park and permanent protected land status that infers long-term benefits for wildlife and people. And I'm going to argue in this part of our presentation that civil and revolutionary war battlefields provide model systems to examine this transition. And I'll exemplify this with Antietam National Battlefield on the next few slides. This evolution from active conflict through memorialization into a protected land status. So Antietam in Western Maryland is the site of the single largest loss of life, US life in US military history, with over 22,000 casualties. And many of you in the room or on the call may be familiar with this type of battlefield map in which we can recount the desperation and nature of the close quarter fighting between General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and General George McClellan's Army of the Potomac. A couple of landscape elements here that I'll point out and come back to later. The sunken road shown right here, where we have right at the front of the battle in the middle of the map. The Burnside Bridge located right here, where General Burnside eventually made his way across Antietam Creek. And these are just a couple sites that I point out, and I'll show pictures of them in a second. But as an aside, these military maps provide incredible insight into what these landscapes looked like 150 years ago. And I have a student this semester who's looking at these types of historical maps of the Richmond area to try to help identify potential locations for current day, we're calling century forests, or patches of forest that are over 100 years old. So if you have any of these historical maps, land cover maps, please share. So the first phase of that active conflict having commenced, the first phase of memorialization from the Battle of Antietam began almost as soon as General Lee's army retreated across the Potomac. For months and even years afterwards, the field was littered with detritus of war, bullets, cannonballs, and even gruesomely skeletal remains. At Antietam, as is true for most sites, the primary concern in the immediate aftermath of war was burying the dead. And the cemetery was dedicated on the 5th anniversary of the Battle of Antietam. And then in July 1879, the cemetery was transferred from the private Antietam National Cemetery Association to the US War Department. That began the long period of federal government oversight at Antietam, and it also coincided with the golden age of battlefield preservation. Because veterans were advocating for saving battlefields, eventually in 1890, Congress listened and designated the first 5 Civil War battlefields. Antietam was among that list. And these federal parks were managed under the War Department to begin with. At this time, the park, Antietam, was only a few acres in size. And that period of conservation stagnated for a while, but then gained renewed attention with the 50-year anniversary of the war. And 13 additional battlefields were designated from 1926 to 1936. Simultaneously, the Civil War battlefields lost some of their value as contemporary military strategy, sites of where generals would go and really strategize about the war. And a larger impetus was put behind their preservation for other purposes. As a result, the federal battlefields like Antietam were turned over from the War Department to the newly developing National Park Service in 1933. And as luck would have it, the battlefield had remained largely unspoiled, which was just luck at that time. The fields had not yet been protected in any way. But today we have a landscape that largely looks like it did in 1962. So returning to the Burnside Bridge that I had mentioned a few minutes ago, this was it. This is a photo of the Burnside Bridge at the kind of time of conflict. And this is what it looks like today. The landscape is very similar, eerily similar, I would say. Or we could look at the Bloody Lane that I talked about before. This is then, and this is now. Obviously, the bodies are gone, and now we have monuments. You can see the tip of the visitor center out here in the distance. But many of the elements are the same. We have fields, we have forests. I feel like I'm going to name all your teams. There's streams, and there's agriculture kind of going on in these landscapes as well. So pretty special places turned over to the National Park Service for their management in the 1930s. However, the National Park Service remained largely interested in these 63 poster child kind of national parks that make documentary filmmakers like Ken Burns swoon. And that would remain a National Park Service priority kind of for years. Kind of like how Jeff Bezos and his cronies have become so enamored with these exotic rainforests halfway around the world. So only 3 of the extent or the remaining of the existing 25 national battlefield parks today have been created since the 1940s. So since the 1940s, we've only created 3 new national battlefield parks within the National Park Service. These are amazing sites. The good news is that although there's not been a ton of new parks protected, there has been a fair amount of new land protected through expansion of existing park boundaries, especially in the lead up to the 150-year sesquicentennial, I love that word, anniversary of the Civil War. And there's a chapter in the book describing this history of expansion. And Parker, you may be talking about some national battlefield expansion projects as well. And of course, our argument is that national parks, national battlefields are just as valuable as those poster child national parks because of the many different ecosystem services that they provide that Peter was walked us through. For some objectives, we'd even argue that national battlefields are more valuable or provide those services even better. As an example, take the call to action report written as part of the National Park Service's 100-year centennial anniversary to provide guidance for the next century of National Park Service management. 4 broad themes were articulated in that document. The first of these themes is connecting people to parks. And one of the specific objectives from this theme is to improve urban residents' awareness of and access to outdoor and cultural experiences close to home by promoting national parks in urban areas. Given that 80% of our US population lives in cities, that objectives make sense to connect people to their parks. So in chapter 2 of the book, Madrone and Tilton compare the number of visitors to national battlefield parks, shown here in yellow, to the number of visitors in national parks, shown in green, per acre. And as you can see, it's not even close. There are many more visitors per acre to battlefield parks, in large part because of their close proximity to urban areas, which are faintly shown in the red on this map. And this makes sense, right? These parks are locations that people wanted to defend the city of Richmond, for example. That's where the battlefields were fought. That's where the parks are now. As opposed to Yellowstone and Glacier, for example, which are out there, in the middle of nowhere, right? Much harder to act. They're destination sites. They're not the sites you go to every day to walk your dog, for example. So there's been tens of millions of visitors to these battlefield parks over the last few decades. Another objective of the 2nd century National Park Service call to action is creating lifelong connections between younger generation and parks through diverse park experiences. And bringing this home to Richmond, here are some of our efforts to create lifelong connections with the parks during a BioBlitz activity that Peter and I kind of engaged with Richmond National Battlefield Park and their managers in 2016. And Virginia really should be a natural leader in protecting these sites. Virginia contains the largest number of these sites, 123 out of 384 documented Civil War battlefields. However, only a small portion of these parks are protected as state and national park lands right now. Other creative ways of protecting these lands have filled in the gaps, as I'm going to turn it over to Parker in a second and we'll learn more about. I just want to end by emphasizing how important it is to take action now, because these landscapes are under threat. Of those 384 battlefield sites inventoried by the Civil War Sites Advisory Commission, 70 have been considered lost completely. 161 are experiencing moderate to high levels of threats. Threats like the proposed development of Disney America, just a few miles from Manassas National Battlefield in the 1990s. And I just like this imagery of a cannon defending the park here at Gettysburg against the onslaught of KFC, right? I like that standing its ground. These threats just keep coming. So this is the latest news out of Manassas. New zoning policies are going into effect, proposals for massive data centers on the boundaries of this park. So those threats will continue, which brings us back to Jeff Bezos. Imagine the irreparable damage to the wildlife, vegetation, and water supply, not to mention the obvious impairment to the historic vistas in the park, if these fields and forests surrounding it are replaced by Disney rides and massive Amazon data centers. We need to protect these lands. Shouldn't we be spending our capital, time, energy to protect places like St. Mary's Church Battlefield in Charles City County and New Market Heights Battlefield in Henrico County, where US colored troops fought and the landscape is steeped in history, not to mention collateral ecosystem services. But these are also some of the most threatened places in Virginia. Shouldn't we be spending our time and energy to protect those sites rather than, for example, sending William Shatner up into space? I don't know, just a thought to leave it out. That I'll turn it over to Parker.
Thanks, Todd. That was the perfect setup, though I don't know if I would have taken such a big dig at Jeff Bezos.
Is this recorded?
But so I'm Parker Agelasto, and I'm the Executive Director for the Capital Region Land Conservancy. I just want to say thank you again for coming out tonight and participating in this program. And I have the fortune of really bringing what Peter Smallwood and Todd Lookingbill have done at the global level and then the state and national level down here to the Richmond level, and really trying to make everybody here understand that we have the cultural landscape that has all of the collateral values that one could have. We have the ability to have the biodiversity protection. We have the ability to really do something towards a 30 by 30 goal if we look at some of these battlefield landscapes. And if we take advantage of some of the federal and state grant programs that help fund the conservation of such battlefield landscapes. And I'm going to focus much on Eastern Henrico because we could talk a lot about what's happening elsewhere. But since the Battle of Newmarket Heights was recently listed by Preservation Virginia as one of the most threatened historic sites in 2021, I'm going to try to focus in and around there. And I've got to find, oh, I can barely see it, the little arrow that I've got to click here. So basically, Capital Region Land Conservancy serves 8 jurisdictions around the city of Richmond. And we're going to be focusing on Henrico, but there's a lot in Charles City, a lot in Hanover, a lot in Chesterfield that all centers around battlefields. And there's much that can be done in this. And this illustration kind of goes back to what Todd was talking about with regards to the establishment of a National Park Service interest in preserving battlefields. And when they finally got to the 1930s, the Richmond National Battlefield Park was authorized by Congress to cover 225,000 acres. That meant that the US government could buy and protect that amount of real estate in our region in 1936. Fast forward, and this is where maybe development pressures of the localities started to come in on Congress. The Civil War Sites Advisory Commission was told, really just tell us what is the most significant property that we need to protect and give us some better boundaries than these large landscapes. And they came up with 38,000 acres of core battlefield as well as study area. But both of those will qualify today for funding. And they really are the places where through maps and through other identifiers, we know that the fighting occurred or that there was major movements and effects of the battle that were significant and therefore the study area. And then in 1995, they came up with what the federal government would actually be willing to acquire for the Richmond National Battlefield Park. and it was cut down to 7,000 acres. Not very much land when you think about starting at 225,000. And today, if you look at Eastern Henrico, the illustration that I show you is all of our core battlefields, according to the Civil War Sites Advisory Commission, shown in that pink. I think it's pink on your screen. The legislative boundary for where the National Park Service can acquire lands is shown in green, with the highlighted area showing what they could acquire, and the infilled green areas of what they have already acquired. So if you look at what I'll call that long linear one, that's Fort Harrison. They've pretty much acquired everything that they are going to do out at Fort Harrison. On the other side, you see another that's mostly filled in. That is around Malvern Hill and Glendale. So with the next 400 acres that will be transferred this year, they will pretty much have covered everything that they could acquire there. And then smack dab in the middle is the Battle of Newmarket Heights, where as of today, the federal government has acquired 0 land. It's important also to show how they have had to determine these battlefields and the troop movements. So highlighted in blue here is actually the Battle of Newmarket Heights and Chaffin's Farm. So you get the sense of there was a battle here and a battle here, and then the troops intersected through these corridors. And that's how we have to interpret these maps. But they are very important because they do affect how we can go about our preservation efforts. Newmarket Heights battlefield has been identified with a core of just over 2,000 acres. And yet the National Park Service has only legislative authority to acquire 270 acres. That's about 12% of the battlefield, of the core battlefield. Not where maybe there was troop movement, but no fighting. This is core battlefield that was significant to understanding the battle. And I show you a little bit of a zoom in so that you get a sense of the landscape around it. There's still very much agricultural purposes and fields around this, but as you start to come across, you see development from where 295 is, the housing, the subdivisions, the encroachment that begins to happen. And at this location, we are 10 miles from downtown Richmond. But this is the land that the Park Service has legislative authority to acquire. And it's important to note that Henrico County has in fact preserved quite a bit of that land that they've acquired for a future park. And it's important to note also that now within this legislative boundary, the American Battlefield Trust has acquired 22 acres, which could be transferred to the Park Service in the future. And Capital Region Land Conservancy is working with some of these landowners as well, and we hope to make future announcements about that activity. However, when we look at this, and we're going back to that 2,000 acres, and when we go back to the notion of 270 acres, we really are down to some limited opportunities to preserve the battlefield. And I think this goes back to what Todd is saying, is we must do more. We must understand the landscape. And here's Todd's map that's going to show where the forest cover was during the battle. This was produced after, but it's an incredible map that illustrates the land use and the troop movement and the location of the fortifications. And it's from those maps that we can then determine where the troops were actually located, how units went around. And frankly, being that we didn't have videotape back then, so we're relying on the documentation of people who created the official war record or people who wrote in letters what they thought was the battle. And sometimes they get the facts wrong. Sometimes they think they're on this stream that was named this and it really wasn't named that, it was somewhere else. So trying to interpret the troop movements becomes a little bit more difficult, and therefore we have to consider the entire landscape as being what they were considering as they went into battle. And at Newmarket Heights, if you're not aware, this was the US colored troops' greatest victory. You've seen the movie Glory. you understand that the US colored troops ended in defeat. In Petersburg, they ended in a major defeat. And yet here at Newmarket Heights, they had what is arguably the greatest accomplishment of any American military action from our colored troops, our African Americans, and they did it in 1864. 14 of them received the Medal of Honor for their valor that day. And when you're fighting in the Civil War, if your commander falls, somebody's got to start ordering the troops. And by the end of the Battle of Newmarket Heights, it was the African American soldiers who were commanding their own troops. And that had not been heard of in America. It becomes a very important landscape from a cultural perspective, from a national perspective of honoring those who made the ultimate sacrifice, but from the collateral values perspective of what the natural resources are. This is what was inherited after the battle. It's barren landscapes, absolute barren, not a tree. Troops camping, waiting to assault onto Richmond. This is what was left in 1865. I share with you some of these other maps about a property that is associated with Newmarket Heights, just to give you some perspective on where the landscape was and where it is heading today. All of the US colored troops crossed the James River on pontoon bridges to then assemble and make their attacks pre-dawn at Newmarket Heights. This is the same location of the pontoon bridge on the James River. This is now protected land thanks to the Capital Region Land Conservancy. It's part of 350 acres that we've recently taken ownership of, but you can see it is not a pristine landscape. It is one that has had its natural resources harvested, and it is one that we will begin to cultivate back into a protected and thriving area for biodiversity and other natural resources. This is part of that property. This is taken from 4 Mile Creek. This is one of the most incredible shorelines that you will find anywhere in Richmond. And you can see how much of it is protected on these maps with the floodplains and with the wetlands. This map happens to show the 350 acres that is currently protected with the historic resources shown, with the barren landscape, and with the public access trails so that it can become a park for recreation, and the thriving biodiversity. Going back to Newmarket Heights and the barren ground. After the Civil War, these landscapes were actually some of the first land that African Americans bought in and around Richmond. They were worthless land. All the timber was gone. You couldn't farm them very easily. But for African Americans, it became some of the first time that they could own property. And they invested themselves and their families into stewarding the property. And you find many cemeteries out in this area. Cultural heritage. But it's being threatened, I think, as Todd mentioned. This is, again, going back to Newmarket Heights with the National Park Service area highlighted in green. And you will see something called the Ridings property. 550 acres, slated for 770 houses, of which 200 acres are within the core battlefield of Newmarket Heights. And the only thing that's kind of stopping it is if a developer chooses to do it or not do it. It's already zoned. It's just a matter of what's the will? What's the will of the people? How much is making a dollar worth when it comes to preserving our cultural heritage and our landscapes? Now, thanks to the Department of Conservation and Recreation, we have the ability to quantify scientifically and show precisely what it is that we want to protect and how threatened they are. So we know that the development is coming. Development is already shown up on this map in red. As it turns orange and then yellow, that is the threat of Eastern Henrico. That is the threat of our Newmarket Heights battlefield. That is the work that will come and take away all of that farmland that I previously showed you. And you can already see the loss of forest integrity. This model is called the forest conservation values. This shows where we have the best forest integrity. And you can already see in those developed areas that we're losing integrity, and it really continues to be pushed further and further away from our city. As it encroaches, it's going to be threatening. The same with our water quality. Water quality. Our drinking water, the water that supplies the Atlantic sturgeon from being able to thrive in the James River. Our streams and our wetlands, where are they left to provide for the habitat and the ecosystem services? Documented element occurrences. Todd referenced the extinction of 22 species. Well, documented element occurrences are where threatened and endangered species have actually been spotted, and we need to do more to preserve them. And again, the same with our natural heritage screening layer. Stream conservation units that have their own ecosystem where different species are thriving amongst each other with this micro habitat. Those are some of the most important biological places left in Virginia to protect. And you can see how they seem to concentrate right in around the river, right near where all the battlefields were located. And the natural land network, for those of you that are not familiar with this model, this is where we actually have wildlife corridors with enough intact habitat that is connecting to one another. You can see it has been pushed to the east, but at least it is still within some of those battlefield areas. Ecological cores, again, even if it's not on a national landscape, what about in strong centers of where there's good habitat? And here the orange is the best, the yellow, the light green, the dark green, spotted, fragmented, but still something that we can do to preserve those strong ecological cores. Farmland, we're losing farmland faster than you know it. There's not a single dairy farm operating in the Capital Region. So what are we doing? This is the map of what has now been protected, whether it is the national park system, whether it is through state acquisition, local acquisition, or private nonprofits doing acquisitions, as well as private conservation easements. We are doing landscape scale preservation and conservation in an area where the landscape has been utterly fragmented, but we're able to do it because it layers onto that cultural landscape. Look to the east where Malvern Hill is and how much has been protected. 6,000 acres of contiguous land is now protected. That means we are operating on a scale that can actually allow for biodiversity to thrive. You can't necessarily do it on an acre by acre basis, but when you get 6,000 1-acre parcels together, you're finally doing it. And I highlight a couple of other areas. This is our Newmarket Heights corridor, and I will get to there in just 1 second. This is why we should be doing conservation in Eastern Henrico. This is a model that the Department of Conservation and Recreation created that shows the top 10% of land in Virginia that should be protected. The entire state of Virginia, this is among the top 10% of land that should be protected. Nearly all of Eastern Henrico fits the model. And it's not just because of the battlefields. Look at this. We have agriculture. We have natural habitat and ecosystem diversity. We have scenic values. We have flooding and flood resiliency. We have water quality. All of that is combining into this landscape. And if it continues to get fragmented, we're going to be cutting off the type of services and ecosystems that we know need to be preserved to keep our Earth from deteriorating further. Now, it does help that this is the cultural heritage model. And it does help that in Conserve Virginia 2.0, the state added every battlefield where the US colored troops fought as being a high priority area for protection. So I'm going to leave you with this. Newmarket Heights. The yellow on this map represents the 550 acres that are slated for development. All the other colors represent land that is protected or that is in the current process of becoming protected. Now, you had Malvern Hill, 6,000 acres. If we can do Newmarket Heights, we will have another 4,000 acres. And if you can't tell, there's a little pink square off to the right. That's the edge of that 6,000 acres protected at Malvern Hill. Just a teeny tiny amount of land in between to create an enormous arch of land preservation going through the battlefields of Malvern Hill, Glendale, Deep Bottom 1, Deep Bottom 2, and Newmarket Heights, connecting public access to the river at Turkey Island Creek to public access to the river at 4 Mile Creek and Deep Bottom, creating a network of trails whereby over the course of numerous days, you could learn about so much of what was sacrificed in the Civil War and really experience firsthand what it was that the US colored troops and others were entering into battle and how we have now come this far, all within 10 miles of downtown Richmond. Think about it. What's your future look like? More subdivisions or the preservation of the only place in the United States where the US colored troops received 14 Medal of Honor recipients? Thank you all.
We have time for a few questions. Let me stop the share so that our guests online can see us. I see a lot of Sure. How about if we start with a couple of questions from chat and then pick up questions from you guys?
What percentage of world battlefields have been maintained or traded and protected?
Good question.
What percentage of,
World battlefields.
Can you repeat the question into the mic?
can you repeat the question for me?
Yes. What percentage of world battlefields have been maintained or turned into protected land?
I don't have a number for that, but I'll tell you that worldwide it is small because it is the wealthiest countries that tend to do that for battlefields. And it has changed, I think, basically since World War II, new battlefields aren't protected that way. So the great battles of old throughout the Middle East, which are documented, and we know where those are generally not, I can't think of a single battlefield park from there. The tremendous battles of the British in Afghanistan, we know where those battle sites are, but countries like that are just not interested in it. It is the wealthy countries that want to do that for their history.
Yeah, for example, you think of the continent of Africa, it's basically South Africa that is protecting their battlefield sites.
So the other question was from Dave Melancon. You talked about the East Coast a lot. Are things any better in the Western and Trans-Mississippi theaters in terms of preservation?
So there's some interesting, I would say actually the East Coast is probably the leader in this regard in protecting the battlefield lands, but not exclusively. So there's some interesting forts that are protected, like throughout Texas actually has a really interesting system of protected forts. And the western coast of the United States actually has the same way we have our system, our fort system protecting the East Coast of the United States. There's a similar set of protected fort lands kind of along on the Pacific. Ohio has some battlefield sites, and so there's patches here and there, but I really think the Civil War, Revolutionary War is where a lot of the action has been at.
Question. Let's take a couple from the audience, and then if we have time, come back.
I have two questions. One, the first one is going back to the more global scale of battlefield preservation. And early on in your presentation, you mentioned the Battle of Verdun from World War I. How can we approach battlefield and ecosystem conservation and preservation for battlefields that have been left too damaged to even repair, such as essentially uninhabitable and would take centuries?
That's an interesting, so the question is, what can we do for battlefields that have been so damaged that it may take centuries for them to recover? Surprisingly enough, nature is shockingly resilient. So the only battlefields I can think of offhand that fit that on a global scale is some of the Roman battles where they salted the agricultural lands of the people they fought against. Remarkably, lands recover. So land that was sprayed with Agent Orange during the Vietnam War and bombed, much of that land looks pretty good now. I'm not saying I would want to I would want to grow and eat food there without having it tested first, but it's remarkable what's come back. So lands that were denuded and heavily mined between Iran and Iraq during their war in the 1980s, that land has come back in part because neither side has the money or the interest to demine it. So nobody goes there. And in fact, they've had the Persian leopard recover in those areas. So I think it's surprising how resilient nature is. Did you want to ask your second?
My second question concerns the report from the National Park Department. So in that report, of course, they're emphasizing, they're putting greater emphasis on connecting urban areas to national parks. And on the east coast and the eastern seaboard, that's a great case for battlefield parks, but how can conservationists get around the issue that apart from the east coast and mainly really east of the Mississippi, there aren't too many significant battlefields that are widely known in the American public conscious that would generate a sufficient amount of litigation for the National Parks Department.
That's a good question. So I would argue that one opportunity.
Do a quick repeat for the people
Yeah,
online.
great. So goal is to have protected lands near urban centers that may not be relevant in all places in the United States or all places of the world. There may not be opportunities for that. And I could, one possibility is to expand our definition of conflict zones, landscapes of warfare. So we have a movement, a bunch of military bases that are being decommissioned in urban areas and in or around urban areas. And there's opportunities to kind of repurpose those. One chapter in our book focuses on Guantanamo Bay and kind of something, new uses for that landscape rather than a prison. So I think you could think more, I think we'd be advocating for just think more creatively.
If I may add, Peter, the other thing I would suggest is that we need to take our interpretation of these properties beyond just simply a day's event, right? This land has been here for millennia. And yes, it may have one day that has forever altered it, but we have discovered through archaeology and other tremendous evidence of prehistoric life on certain properties in and around this area, with the Native American population that thrived before the Anglo settlers. There's so much evidence and not enough documentation to be able to then tell that story in a way that is engaging or meaningful today because we haven't done enough research. And as I was describing, after the battles, the fact that there was this period in Eastern Henrico when African Americans were establishing community and getting ownership of land for the very first time. That's a period of history that is also not well covered. And it's this, you have to, through land conservation, one of the things that we do is we do title research. We figure out who owned the land. We understand that. And we're fortunate enough to get grants to do some of the archaeology that can reveal some of the historic elements that might not otherwise be told through the written record. So I think that might be another way of opening up the conversation to getting people to some of these battlefield parks.
We are now past the 8 o'clock hour. So I think I need to close it here. I'll invite all of you in the room to please eat the food in the courtyard, and we'll be out there in a moment. We can discuss further and take further of your questions. For those of you online, I thank you very much for attending. And please go to the Environmental Studies Program website to see the future of additional global environmental speakers series.
Now, Peter, if I may, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, the University of Richmond, for hosting this talk tonight. And I'm very much looking forward to the reception. However, we are in the middle of CRLC's 2021 Conservation Games. So can I bear with everybody to give folks at home the opportunity to answer some trivia questions? And if you don't want to stay for the trivia, by all means, you can log off, but you get extra points for the games if you answer the trivia questions correctly. And I'm going to test these two scholarly knowledge,
Oh, no.
if I may. So Peter, can we get to those questions quickly? And in the meantime, if you don't know what the 2021 Conservation Games are, this is our 3-week free program where we have people sign up to join Team Fields, Team Forest, or Team Streams, and they compete to earn points, whether it's through a learning program like this evening, or volunteering programs like we're doing a tree planting at the Science Museum, or through giving and supporting our work doing land conservation in the Richmond region. So with that, let's get to the questions. You want to do the questions, Peter?
You got it.
Trivia. I hope you'll have trivia nights still in college. Okay. What is the size of an average farm in Henrico County according to the most recent 2017 Census of Agriculture? Is it 23 acres, 99 acres, 146 acres, 168 acres, or 205 acres? And I can only tell you it has been shrinking over time. And if you write down your answer and have it correct, let us know. You can submit your points. But the correct answer is 99 acres. Question 2. Hanover County, Virginia is best known for growing what produce? Is it tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, cabbage, or corn? Depending on who you ask, that you might get a different answer. But I don't think they're known for peanuts. That's my best clue. So the correct answer is Hanover tomatoes. And they have a whole festival for Hanover tomatoes. Next question, Peter. Which battlefield does Capital Region Land Conservancy not currently hold the conservation easement? Malvern Hill, Deep Bottom 1, Deep Bottom 2, Ware Bottom Church, or Newmarket Heights. And I am sure most of you have never heard of half of these battlefields.
Well, you mentioned like all of them in the talk, Parker.
So the answer is Ware Bottom Church. And Ware Bottom Church is in Chesterfield County, which we're actually working with the county on right now to place an easement on 50 acres, which will be a public park. Next question, Peter. What is a characteristic of prime farmland per the USDA definition? This is really a question about fields. It's not so much on battlefields, but adequate and dependable supply of moisture from precipitation, favorable temperature and growing season, few or no rocks, slope of 0 to 6%, or all of the above. It's definitely an all of the above, Todd. Good job. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand what is prime farmland, and it's very important. And the final question, Peter, between 1978 and 2017, what percent of agricultural land has been converted in the entire Richmond region? Was it 9.1%, 17.6%, 23.4%, 25.3%, or 66.8%? And I will tell you, each of these numbers associates either with the region, which is going to be the answer, or with the particular locality within the region? The correct answer for the entire region is 25.3%. The conversion with the highest, the 66.8%, was in Henrico County.
So with that, I thank you again, and I invite you to, those of you in the room, please help yourself to some food. The three speakers will be there shortly, and hope to see you at a future Global Environmental Speakers event. Thank you.
How many questions?
So
What's the song?
you're still
What was the first one?
You
What was
are
the first
the
one?
host now, so I can.
The first one was the average farm size in Henrico.
Right. Got it, exactly. My presentation was